There are places we pass by without a second thought, patches of forest too dense to enter, valleys swallowed in silence, or trails that lead to nowhere. Hidden among them are stories we no longer tell, names erased from maps and lives that faded before their stories could find permanence. Deep in the Ozark Mountains, where the land resists easy taming and the seasons cut sharp against those who dare to settle there, lingers one such story, the lost settlement of Silver Creek. In 1907, Silver Creek was not a town known beyond its narrow borders. It was little more than a collection of cabins, a modest blacksmith shop, and a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse. But to the families who trudged across muddy wagon roads to settle there, Silver Creek was not small or insignificant. It was opportunity. It was survival. It was hope carved into the folds of a landscape both breathtaking and brutal. The Ozarks at the turn of the century were not the paradise outsiders might imagine when gazing at rolling ridges from afar. The terrain was harsh. Sharp limestone outcrops clawed through the soil, leaving little farmland worth ploughing. Dense hardwood forests cloaked the hills, offering timber, but also cutting off light and space for crops. Water flowed swiftly in creeks and springs, but floods could sweep away everything in a single night. To live here meant isolation. It meant that every nail driven, every furrow ploughed, and every roof raised required not just willpower, but resilience seasoned by hardship. And yet, people came. They came because land was cheap. They came because the crowded farmlands of the Midwest and the sweat-filled factories of larger cities pushed them out, promising little more than endless labor and poverty. They came because the Ozarks, for all their challenges, whispered that maybe, just maybe, one could find independence here. A patch of land to call their own, space to breathe, a chance to shape life by their own terms. Silver Creek was born from this yearning. The small settlement took its name from the narrow stream that wound through its valley. In the early morning light, when mist clung low and the water caught the sun, the creek reflected silver, as if the earth itself gave a silent blessing. Families gathered water from it daily, livestock drank from its banks, and children played along its edges. Naming the town after the creek was a sign of gratitude, and perhaps of optimism, that this humble stream would nourish them with more than water, with permanence itself. At first, Silver Creek looked promising. The land offered timber, and nearby hills promised stone quarrying opportunities. The valley, though limited, provided fertile ground where corn and beans took root. Men with calloused hands built cabins from freshly cut logs, while women tended gardens and raised children in a new rhythm dictated by the wilderness. A blacksmith named Elijah Barnes set up shop at the edge of the settlement, his hammer echoes becoming the town's first voice of industry. His forge was small, but it gave the settlers a sense that Silver Creek could grow into something more stable, more lasting. Silver Creek's schoolhouse doubled as a church. The wooden structure stood on a small rise, its plain appearance offset by the sound of hymns that drifted softly across the valley on Sundays. During the week, children of all ages sat on long benches, scratches on their notebooks marking their determination to learn. Education was scarce in these hills, but in Silver Creek, the presence of a teacher, Miss Caroline Huffman, barely 20 years old, who had come from Springfield, was a symbol of dignity and progress. She believed Silver Creek could become a model of what small-town perseverance might achieve. To outsiders, Silver Creek might have seemed unremarkable compared to the bustling logging towns that dotted the Ozarks at the time. But to those who lived there, life felt hopeful. Each sunrise meant another chance to claim ownership of their fate. The laughter of children over the creek, the scent of cornbread baking in iron ovens, and the heartbeat of hammers striking iron, these were the sounds of a place being born. Yet even in these early days, subtle signs of fragility lingered. Travel was grueling. The nearest town with a proper store and doctor was nearly 20 miles away, a distance that meant entire days lost when wagons sank into mud or horses refused to press on. Silver Creek was small enough that one bad harvest, one epidemic, or one fire could undo everything. The settlers knew this, of course, but hope has a strange blindness to it. When people believe they are at the start of something greater, they often ignore the shadows gathering at the edges. What haunts us now about Silver Creek is not only that it disappeared, but how quickly it did. Within less than a decade, the settlement would be gone, its cabins abandoned, its schoolhouse empty, its fields reclaimed by weeds, its families scattered into silence. No single event or tragedy alone explains it. Instead, its erasure from history appears to have been the product of many small misfortunes, compounded until the dream could no longer hold. But in 1907, none of that was visible. To the men and women walking its narrow dirt lanes, Silver Creek felt alive. For every weary backbreaking under the weight of survival, there was also a spirit of new possibilities. The settlers were not dreamers expecting fortune. They were pragmatists seeking endurance, a chance to pass down a better life to their children. The Ozarks may have been relentlessly harsh, but they had decided to stake everything against it. And that is where the story of Silver Creek begins, with determination, with resilience, and with the fragile optimism of people who believed their community could last. They could not know their town would one day vanish so completely that only scattered whispers remain. They could not know that future generations would search in vain for its markers, finding only forest floor and silence. In their eyes, Silver Creek was permanent, planted firmly in the soil by their own sweat. But permanence in the Ozarks is a dangerous illusion. The forest is patient. The land always reclaims. As we step deeper into this story, we will trace the families that built Silver Creek, the routines that defined their daily lives, and the signs that would slowly unravel their work. To understand why the town vanished, we must first feel what it was like to live there, to rise with the dawn mist over the creek, to labor in fields cut from forest, and to gather in a one-room church where voices lifted not only in prayer, but in defiance against isolation. For now, it is enough to remember that in 1907, Silver Creek was alive and it believed it would remain so. In the earliest years of Silver Creek, life balanced carefully between hardship and hope. Families who had staked everything on this settlement worked tirelessly, their survival dependent on the labor of each member, no matter how young or old. The mornings began before sunrise. Roosters crowed in the still valley air, and thin smoke rose from chimneys as fires struggled to push warmth into cabins still damp with nightly chill. The Ozark dawn was quiet except for the steady rhythm of life being carved out by determined hands. The families who built Silver Creek were not adventurers chasing fortune. They were farmers, loggers, and tradesmen, drawn to these hills by necessity more than desire. Many had drifted from neighboring states, Missouri, Arkansas, and even further north, pushed by rising land costs and shrinking opportunities. Here in this hidden hollow where the creek gleamed in the morning light, they sought what cities denied them, a place they could claim, protect, and grow. By 1908, only a year after the town was first marked on a surveyor's map, Silver Creek had grown to nearly a dozen cabins. Each was simple, hewn from nearby timber and sealed with clay, but each represented countless hours of sweat and sacrifice. Families shared lumber, tools, and even labor, knowing that survival was not an individual pursuit, but a collective struggle. If one cabin roof failed, neighbors corrected it. If illness spread through one household, others shared food so the sick would not starve. Theirs was a life of interdependence, a rhythm unfamiliar to outsiders, but essential to those within. The heart of Silver Creek quickly became its small plots of farmland. Cornfields spread across narrow clearings, and pumpkin vines curled stubbornly along the edges of stony soil. The harvests were modest, but the community celebrated them with fierce gratitude. Grain was ground into flour at a hand-cranked mill, and livestock, chickens, hogs, and a few head of cattle, offered meat, milk, and eggs. Nothing came easy, but each meal set on the table carried a taste of victory. And yet Silver Creek was more than a survivalist camp. It was also a place of spirit. The schoolhouse church on the hillside was not only a structure of wood and nails, it was the soul of the community. On Sundays, families gathered dressed in their best, voices weaving together in hymns that echoed through the valley. For these settlers, faith and resilience were inseparable. Hope was nourished in prayer, and determination reinforced by Scripture. On weekdays, children filled the same pews reciting their lessons under the patient eye of Miss Huffman. She lived in one of the smallest cabins, but possessed a vision far greater than her surroundings. She often told her students, "A place is not measured by its size, but by the stories it leaves behind." Ironically, her words would one day take on a meaning she could not have anticipated. The blacksmith's forge remained the steady hum of Silver Creek, Elijah Barnes, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, worked long hours shaping nails, horseshoes, and tools. Each strike of his hammer reminded the settlers that progress was possible. His forge became a gathering place just as much as it was a workplace where men spoke about crops, weather, and sometimes their quiet fears of what the next season might bring. But beneath the optimism, difficulties crept in. Roads remained treacherous. Silver Creek's seclusion, a gift for those seeking independence, was also its curse. When wagons sank in the mud, when horses went lame, and when winter storms cut the settlement off from everything beyond the valley, the people felt their fragility. Supplies ran thin, and barter carried them only so far. Salt, sugar, and medicine were so rare at times that they became currencies of their own. The winter of 1908 was especially harsh. Heavy snow buried the valley, creaking against cabin roofs and bending trees under its weight. Families huddled close to fading fires, rationing food while winds howled against their walls. For some, the long nights bred doubt, questions of whether Silver Creek could ever be permanent. Yet they endured. When spring finally thawed the land, something remarkable happened. Instead of retreating, the settlers seemed more determined. Fields were expanded, new fences raised, and cabins strengthened against the uncertainties ahead. Their resolve was clear. Silver Creek was not yet ready to surrender. It was during this time that a sense of true community blossomed. Weddings were conducted in the church, tying families together in bonds of both faith and necessity. Births were celebrated as triumphs, proof that life could take root even in the harshest conditions. And though illness occasionally swept through the cabins, neighbors watched over each other, never allowing one family to carry the burden alone. But quietly, the challenges gathered. Every settlement in the Ozarks faced struggles, yet Silver Creek was uniquely vulnerable. Isolated in its hidden hollow, it had no clear trade routes, no railroad spur to draw outside commerce, and no government recognition beyond its name on a survey map. To outsiders, Silver Creek did not exist in practice. It was a ghost in waiting, though its residents lived as if tomorrow were promised. By 1909, a few traders from nearby towns began to notice the small community. They sold tools, salted meat, and other essentials at inflated prices, capitalizing on the settlement's isolation. The settlers paid what they could, often at great cost, because they had no other choice. Slowly, the dream of independence that had birthed Silver Creek began to tilt into dependency. Yet the people believed they could manage, that the demands of outsiders would not outweigh the strength within. In their hearts, they still held faith. But history would prove that no settlement survives on determination alone. The very things that defined Silver Creek, its isolation, its fragility, its reliance on fragile bonds between families, would also become the forces that conspired against it. Still, in these early years, Silver Creek lived. It grew in its own quiet way, rooted more in stubbornness than prosperity. Families woke each day, planted each field, raised each child, and prayed each Sunday as if permanence had already been earned. They could not yet hear the silence creeping into their valley, the silence that would one day erase them from memory. By 1910, Silver Creek had reached a stage that many of its settlers considered the peak of what they hoped would become a lasting community. Nearly 20 families called the valley home, and the cluster of cabins, smoke rising gently from their chimneys, suggested at first glance a settlement growing slowly but steadily against the rough backdrop of the Ozark Hills. Fields stretched further along the creek than they once had. Fences lined the edges where livestock grazed, and paths well worn by boots and wagon wheels testified that life here was no longer just a gamble. To a stranger wandering down those dirt tracks, Silver Creek might have looked permanent. But permanence in the Ozarks was always a fragile illusion, and for all the signs of growth, Silver Creek was beginning to strain at its seams. The settlers had built their lives on the back of isolation. At first it was a gift, smoothing away the noise and interference of the outside world. They had escaped rents that gnawed at every paycheck in towns further north, had fled the smoke-filled air of Springfield and other busy pockets, and had come to this valley imagining a place where they could build with their own hands, where every improvement was their own. But as the years stretched, isolation became more curse than blessing. The road in and out was little more than a twisting ribbon of dirt beaten by wagon wheels. When it rained, those wheels sank until horses refused to drag the weight further. When snow and ice came, the path hardened like stone and froze men into immobility. Supplies that should have taken a day to fetch could cost 3 or 4, and the men sent for them returned exhausted, their children already asleep on pallet beds when the wagon finally rattled back in at dusk. By then, much of what they had purchased was half gone in value, given away in barter or promised against another family's need. Traders who came to them instead charged prices outrageously high, knowing the settlers could do little but pay. A bag of salt might sell for double, flour nearly triple the price a townsman would pay just a few counties over. Families pooled what coins they could, stretched barter as far as it would go, and learned to do without whenever possible. But no amount of neighborly sharing could reproduce kerosene for lamps, or quinine for fever, or nails for mending. With each passing season, the community's vulnerability to outsiders deepened, and the sense of independence that had once been the settlement's pride became a thin mask covering their disadvantage. With hardship came tension. At the beginning, cooperation had been their greatest defense, a shield against the difficulties the land threw at them. Cabins were raised by all hands together, fences built by whoever could push a post into the stubborn soil, but now the cracks appeared. The Johnson family, with their hogs penned wide near the stream, often found their animals roaming across the Whitakers' fields, tearing stalks and trampling furrows. What might once have been easily forgiven now became cause for bitter words, carried down the valley and repeated by children in whispers that quickly reached the ears of others. Debts went unpaid longer than before, and the accusation of who owed what to whom began to sour conversations in front of Elijah Barnes's blacksmith shop. That forge, once the symbol of Silver Creek's budding permanence, rang with more than hammer blows. Voices sharpened, suspicions grew, and Elijah himself, broad-shouldered and patient as stone, grew weary of settling quarrels. Then nature pressed down her hand more forcefully. The spring of 1910 was wet, mercilessly wet. For weeks the rain fell, steady sheets that turned wagon paths into arteries of mud and filled the creek until it screamed against its banks. The water rose higher than the oldest settler had yet seen it, swallowing the edges of cornfields, pulling away fence posts, filling the valley with the smell of damp rot. Cabins close to the water suffered most, their floors soaked, root cellars ruined, food spoiled in a matter of days. Families retreated up the hillside, carrying what little stores they could save in their arms, as chickens and pigs scattered across the muck. When finally the rain gave way and the water receded, what it left behind was ruin. Rows of young sprouts drowned in the mud, soil too waterlogged to seed again, pastures stripped of grass that would take months to regrow. They salvaged what they could, but all knew the harvest would be lean, and with it the long Ozark winter far leaner. Out of that lean harvest, sickness came, carried not by mystery, but by the unbroken logic of poverty and hunger. Influenza swept through the cabins, children first, then their parents, dragging strong men down onto straw beds with fever, crushing already weary mothers under fresh burdens. There was no doctor within reach. Home remedies of teas, plasters and prayers did what they could, but in the cold weeks of 1910, more than one family wept over small coffins lowered into Ozark soil. The church bell tolled whenever it could, a hollow reminder that though Silver Creek had once celebrated weddings and births, now its voice was also the voice of mourning. Few words were spoken after such funerals. Grief was a private thing in the mountains. Faces drawn thin and pale returned to their daily grind, because to stop entirely was to perish too. Yet the silence afterward pressed heavier than before, and in that silence bloomed doubts no settler dared voice too loudly. By the summer of 1911, those doubts began to show themselves in small but undeniable ways. Young men, restless and watchful, spoke more openly about the letters that arrived from outside the valley, letters telling of work in larger towns, of sawmills hiring by the hundreds, of new rail spurs drawing settlements into prosperity. They dreamed in whispers of wages not paid in barter, of store shelves never empty, of streets dry in the rain. For the older generation, tied to the soil by habit and pride, such talk felt like betrayal. But for the youth, the horizon itself seemed to beckon. At home, parents sat under the pale flicker of lamps, tallying silently the balance between what the land took from them and what it gave back. Some crops would grow, but never in abundance. Some years would allow for a decent harvest, but never without disaster waiting just beyond the bend, for the storms, for the illnesses, for the endless fights over resources stretched too thin. A man in Silver Creek built his life by gambling on endurance, but endurance alone did not feed children or promise them anything better than the same struggle tomorrow. Beneath the hollow's hard-working exterior, the certainty of permanence began to disintegrate, and yet even so, Silver Creek lived on. Families still gathered for harvest feasts, even when meals were thin. Children still splashed in the creek on hot afternoons, their squeals rising above the valley like defiance itself. Neighbors still joined to repair one another's barns when storms tore through, carrying shingles and beams up roads slick with mud. To all appearances, the town was still what it had always been, a stubborn outpost carved into the hills. But for anyone patient enough to listen, the changes could be heard. Conversations once filled with optimism turned cautious. Laughter rang less frequently at the smithy. Eyes sometimes lingered westward on the ridge, as if measuring the width of escape. Silver Creek had not yet seen its end, but the forces that would undo it were already at play. Human division, relentless isolation, economic disadvantage, and the natural cruelty of the landscape were weaving together, tightening each month, each season. The seams of the settlement were straining badly now. No one could know just how quickly fabric tears once the threads begin to strain, but the silence history would leave in this valley was already approaching. By 1912, Silver Creek was no longer the same community it had been only 5 years before. The cabins still stood, the creek still shone in silver ribbons at dawn, and Sunday hymns still rose gently into the air, but an invisible weight pressed heavier over the valley. The people who lived there felt it with every passing season, even if they tried not to speak of it. The hardships had compounded, floods that stripped their crops, sickness that dimmed once lively households, and disputes among neighbors that rarely found true resolution. What had once been a dream of freedom had begun to feel like a slow suffocation. And for the first time, families began to make the most difficult decision imaginable. They began to leave. The first to go were the Millers. John Miller was a thin, hollow-eyed man whose back had bent early from years of labor. He had come to Silver Creek with the promise that the soil would give him independence. For a while he believed it. But after years of harvests broken by rain, debts swollen from unscrupulous traders, and the loss of his youngest child to influenza, John had little left to believe in. One morning, the sound of wagon wheels echoed through the valley, not with supplies returning but with belongings packed high. His wife sat silent beside him, her eyes fixed on the ground, while 2 older boys walked behind, their boots leaving deep impressions in the damp earth that led out of the hollow. Neighbors lined the lane, saying little. Parting words were offered, prayers at best, but resentment lingered behind the silence too. For those who remained, the Millers were both envied and pitied. To leave was a betrayal of the settlement's dream, but secretly many wondered if it was also an act of wisdom. Their empty cabins stood like a scar. At first the community tried to maintain it, stacking wood near the door and sweeping its floor, as if the family might return. But weeks passed, and the roof began to sag where rains slipped between the shingles. Grass grew tall along the fence. The absence of voices within those walls served as a reminder that Silver Creek was not as unshakable as they wanted to believe. Soon after, another family, the Carters, followed. Their decision came not from despair alone, but from opportunity. A cousin in Springfield had sent word of jobs opening at a mill, steady wages that promised food on the table without the endless gamble of tilling thin Ozarks soil. The Carters loaded their ox-drawn wagon under the dim twilight of early dawn, perhaps hoping to slip away quietly. But no one in Silver Creek could ignore the echo of wheels on gravel. Children clung to friends, weeping openly, their small worlds suddenly fractured. Neighbors shook hands firmly, men trying not to appear bitter, women promising to keep in touch somehow, but all knew what such promises were worth. Letters rarely found their way back into this valley. Once a family left, they belonged to the outside world, pulled into a current no one here could follow. As families departed, the ones who stayed behind felt the loss more keenly than they admitted. Each absence was not just a missing voice around the church pews or another swing silent on the creek bank. It was labor gone, support withdrawn, a roof no longer repaired by extra hands. The settlement was not large enough to lose members without consequence. Every departure pressed harder on those who remained, stretching their work, deepening their isolation, and still, despite the mounting weight, people clung stubbornly to their lives in Silver Creek. The Johnsons strengthened their hog pens and planted more corn, refusing to let the soil beat them. The Whitakers fortified their fences against floods, convinced that the next season would be kinder. The blacksmith's forge continued to burn, though Elijah Barnes worked longer hours alone now, his customers fewer, his gatherings quieter. And each Sunday, Miss Huffman still called the children to their benches, even if there were fewer to teach. She taught as though the future were certain, her chalk scratching out lessons on the worn slate board, her voice carrying hope that perhaps the next generation would find permanence where their parents had struggled in vain. Yet whispers traveled quickly. Some families confessed to others in private that they too might eventually go if another flood came, if sickness returned, if debts grew too heavy. The conversation was never public, but the valley could feel the uncertain tide. Once people spoke with pride about the roots they were planting in this soil. Now their language shifted. Instead of permanence, they spoke of for now. Instead of planning for decades ahead, they spoke quietly of one more year. It was the language of a people already half detached, as though leaving was no longer unthinkable, but inevitable. The departures carved deeper cracks in the fragile identity of Silver Creek. The settlement had no government recognition, no trade route, no reinforcements line to come from outside. It existed only because families insisted it existed. When they began to walk away, the very idea of Silver Creek itself started to wither. Even those who believed they would never leave learned to look at their homes differently. Cabins were no longer timeless investments, passed from fathers to sons. They became shelters for as long as endurance held out. Fences no longer marked forever farms. They were simply boundaries that lasted until another flood tore them down, or until the family who built them decided they had had enough. By 1913, the hollow felt dimmer. Nights were quieter, the glow of lamplight fewer along the valley. The creek continued to rush, silver in the dawn, but it reflected fewer figures along its banks. Silence crept into corners where laughter had once risen, and that silence did not lift easily. Families carried on, but all knew in unspoken ways that Silver Creek was beginning to die. It was not a sudden death nor a violent one. It was a slow fading, one departure at a time, one empty cabin after another, until the settlement that had once pulsed with ambition now beat with only a faint, faltering rhythm. For those who stayed, the dream was not yet extinguished. They rose at dawn, worked their fields, kept their animals, prayed in their church, and hammered metal at the forge, pretending all was as it had always been. But under that routine beat the undeniable truth. Silver Creek had lost something essential when the first wagon rolled out of the valley and never returned. What had been one community was no longer whole. What had felt like a permanent home now carried the weight of uncertainty. And though no one would speak it plain, all feared the same thing, that the slow trickle outward might in time become a flood. By 1914, Silver Creek had become a place of contrast. On the surface, life appeared unchanged. Smoke still drifted upward from a cluster of chimneys. The clamor of farm animals broke the stillness of the mornings, and on Sundays the church still filled with song, though fewer voices carried the hymns. But beneath those enduring rhythms, the heartbeat of the settlement had slowed. Those who remained carried not only the burdens of survival, but also the weight of absence. Each family that stayed shouldered more work, filling gaps left behind, but deep within themselves most already knew they were clinging to shadows. The empty cabins never failed to remind them. They stood as hollow shells, weathering quickly under the Ozarks seasons. Shutters swung in the wind until they fell loose. Weeds burst through floors and moss crept up the walls. The stillness around these abandoned homes was almost unbearable, for they did not simply mark the absence of people. They marked the absence of conviction, the broken belief that Silver Creek could last. When newcomers had once arrived, there had been celebration, neighbors lending tools and arms in the raising of new roofs. But now the wheel of departure turned faster than arrival. No wagons came into the hollow, carrying fresh families eager for land. They only carried worn belongings out, bound for towns where life might not be easier. But at least it promised connection to the world beyond. Still, Those who stayed fought with a stubbornness born not of optimism, but of pride. Men rose at dawn to furrow fields that had been half drowned by the last flood, determined to drag harvests from soil that yielded reluctantly. Women stretched supplies further than logic allowed, turning scraps into meals, saving flour for occasions when its taste might lift spirits against the cloud of despair. The children who remained learned to take on extra duties, tending younger siblings, guarding fields from strays, hauling water in buckets almost too heavy for their hands. Childhood here had always been brief, but now it shortened further, replaced by necessity, the kind that allowed no refusal. The church services were smaller but no less fervent. Preacher's words grew louder, sharper, tinged with urgency. He spoke of tests of faith, of endurance demanded by God, and of rewards that surely awaited those who did not falter. Families sang louder, as if to lift their community upon the strength of their voices alone. Yet even within the fervor of prayer, all felt the empty seats press upon them. They were not merely singing for endurance anymore. In truth, they were singing for survival, trying to drown out the gnawing sense that their community's life was draining. The smithy continued to echo, though more hollowly than before. Elijah Barnes still worked, hammer striking in steady rhythm, shaping plowshares, sharpening blades, repairing hinges. But too many of his customers were gone, and too few coins circulated among the remaining. Barter replaced payment, a sack of beans, a coil of rope, an extra chicken. He took what he could, but even he could not escape the sinking truth. A trade built to serve a community dwindled as the community dwindled. He hammered not only iron but also silence, filling absence with sound. The young men of Silver Creek grew restless. They stared longer at the horizon, restless with stories of towns alive with lights and railroads, where days did not begin and end with the stubborn rhythm of survival. Word of the Great War in Europe trickled into even this hollow, reaching their ears as both wonder and temptation. Tales of enlisting, of uniform and pay, spread through the valley like sparks. Though the Ozarks were far removed from geopolitics, even in Silver Creek, the idea of leaving held both fear and fascination. For the older generation, that restlessness was a wound. They had poured their years into cabins, fences, and fields. Their labor was their defiance against the world that had dismissed them to these hills, but their sons looked at the same ground with other eyes, seeing not permanence but limits, seeing not endurance but prison. There were quiet arguments at dining tables, fathers demanding loyalty to the land, sons asking why their loyalty should be chained to a place that gave them so little in return. By 1915, more families yielded to the tide. The Smiths gathered their children and left for Springfield. The Petersons followed soon after, traveling farther north to join cousins in St. Louis. Each departure deepened the thinning fabric. Where there had once been 20 families, fewer than half remained. The cabins no longer formed a village so much as scattered households, clinging to the illusion of one. Winter nights grew quieter without neighbors close, lantern light fewer across the dark ridge. When storms fell, no chain of men walked in unison to repair fences or cabins. When sickness struck, there were fewer hands to spread the burden. When the bells rang for gatherings, the hollow carried back their sound more boldly than the congregation inside. Silver Creek was becoming not a community, but an echo of community. And yet, those who stayed told themselves they fought for something larger, that giving up now would betray all they had endured, that the tombstones of their children and elders deserved the permanence of an existing home around them. But in truth, Silver Creek was being hollowed by time itself. Each year's departure carved away more of its structure, until what remained was not the dream of 1907, but only fragments. And though the rhythm of daily labor continued, though strong hands still cut through timber and furrows, the truth was unmistakable. Silver Creek was slipping toward silence. By 1916, the hollow of Silver Creek no longer resembled the young, eager settlement its families had once carved into the Ozark Hills. Time had weathered it not in decades, but in a mere handful of years, pressing down on every foundation stone, every fence post, every man and woman who had fought to give this place permanence. It was still alive, but the life it carried felt strained, thin, and half-departed, like a body breathing only because the spirit within had not yet let go. The cabins still stood along the creek. Some smoke still rose when winter's bite came sharp. Children still laughed here and there on summer afternoons. But in every corner one could see how much had been lost. The abandoned homes were impossible to ignore. Each time a family packed its wagon and left, they left behind not only walls and roof, but also an echo of themselves. For a few weeks, neighbors might extend care, stacking wood by the door, sweeping debris from the porch, hopeful that perhaps the family would return. But no one ever came back. Slowly, weeds claimed the yards, shutters rattled until they fell loose, windows shattered and let the weather in, roof beams warped beneath years of rain and sun. The cabins became markers of defeat, monuments not to struggle but to surrender. Children running past them slowed their steps, eyes wide, as if the air inside were haunted, not by ghosts but by the memory of laughter silenced too soon. The emptiness spread in subtle ways. The road through Silver Creek had once seemed alive with motion. The whir of wagon wheels carrying goods, the rhythm of boots crunching gravel, the hum of voices as men traveled back from the forge, with iron newly shaped by Elijah Barnes's careful hand. Now that road was lonelier. Wagons still came, but fewer and fewer. Families did not walk together between cabins as they once had, exchanging greetings, trading goods, lending tools. The lanes were quiet, dust rising alone in the wind, no footsteps to stir it up. The church remained the last stubborn heart of Silver Creek, and yet even here the hollowness was unmistakable. On Sunday mornings, the sound of hymns lifted still but thinner now, each note stretching across the valley without the reinforcement of numbers. The preacher delivered words fierce with urgency, reminding his flock that endurance itself was a prayer, that every day they fought to remain was proof of God's design. But the pews had gaps, wide stretches of wood left empty, and those who sat in them found their voices softening whenever their eyes caught sight of just how many were gone. Children twisted in place, restless, fewer with every passing season. Their teacher did her best to lift them with talk of futures built from words, numbers, knowledge, but even she felt the truth pressing in. Each time she wrote letters across the blackboard, she knew she was not teaching permanence here, she was teaching departure. The smartest, the strongest, the most ambitious among these children would be the first to go. That was the irony of her dedication. To do her job well was to lose those she taught. Down by the smithy, Elijah Barnes still struck his hammer on the anvil, the same rhythm that had once been the music of the town. The sound carried through the valley, but even it had changed. Where once men gathered by his forge, waiting for tools to mend, swapping stories and disputes cracked with laughter, now there was silence broken only by iron against iron. When neighbors did stop by, it was not with coins in their pocket but with chickens, sacks of beans, an old rope, anything they could spare in barter. Elijah took what was offered, not with resentment but with resignation. He understood, perhaps more than any of them, that the forge needed people to survive. With fewer men tending fields, fewer plows dulled by labor, fewer wagons rattling along the road, even iron lost its necessity. His fire sputtered, not because he had grown weary, but because the valley itself had less to demand. The rhythm of communal survival, neighbors assisting in floods, building barns or tending fires when sickness struck, was broken. Families remained, but each became more isolated, bound inside their own walls. One cabin repaired its roof without the line of men shouldering shingles. One field was plowed without neighbors to follow behind. Storms visited the valley, tearing at shingles, tossing branches against fences, but no chain of neighbors came running as they once had. And so slowly, each family sank further into itself. What had once been mutual dependence had become solitary endurance. Nature pressed harder each year. In the wet spring seasons, the creek rose high, sometimes breaking free of its banks to tear into fields already scarce. In winters, the cold bit through chinks in the cabin walls more fiercely, the sound of coyotes echoing closer now that livestock pens were abandoned or thin. The forest advanced wherever settlers pulled back. Weeds reclaimed paths no longer used. Saplings sprouted between fence posts until the fences bent beneath their weight, and the silence that hung over it all was thick, palpable, unsettling to those who remembered how full this hollow once sounded. Perhaps the heaviest blow was not in what the land took, but in what restless youth began to seek outside its borders. For young men, the call of distant places became irresistible. Tales of the Great War, though distant in Europe, trickled through nearby towns and into the hollow. News traveled of recruiting stations, of uniforms and pay, of meals guaranteed, and the promise that young men who left for the service would see worlds beyond these narrow hills. For others, the lure of railroads, lumber mills, and the growing cities of Missouri and Arkansas planted seeds of doubt in their hearts. Why stay in a place where every year's survival was uncertain, when elsewhere opportunity was steady, and work, though hard, gave wages instead of debts? One by one, some of those young men left. Some did so with quiet words behind to their families, promising they would return once their fortunes were better, though few ever did. Others slipped away without fanfare, their absence discovered only when morning came, and their pallets were empty, their tools left behind unsaid. To the parents who remained, each departure cut twice, once as the loss of a son or daughter, and again as evidence that their community's future no longer lay here. With each departure, the settlement's tomorrow grew thinner. By 1917, fewer than 10 families still held Silver Creek together, and even they seemed not so much bound as scattered in the same valley. The streets where laughter once rose in chorus were now dark most nights, their lamps unlit, windows shuttered. The nights grew darker, longer, filled with sounds of wilderness seeping back in. Coyotes prowled closer to farms, owls called from rafters, and in the silence between these noises lingered an unmistakable truth. Nature was returning, patient and slow, waiting only for the last few families to decide they too had had enough. And yet, for all the despair life went on, it always goes on even at the edge of endings. Families rose each morning and tended their fields, perhaps thinner than they once had, perhaps more silent but still determined. Preachers still raised voices on Sunday, perhaps louder, though only to mask the emptiness. Children still ran barefoot along the banks of the creek, scattering minnows, though fewer now, their small laughter sounding almost lonely as it bounced between the valley walls. And the forge still clanged with steel, though it rang hollow now, producing less work for fewer customers. To those who visited from outside, Silver Creek was already dying. It was spoken of in larger towns with pity or mockery, a place barely hanging on. For traders it had little importance now, a stop avoided unless the profit justified the hardship of travel. To historians in years ahead, Silver Creek would not make the maps nor the index pages of county records. It was already being erased, its story slipping not with violence but with neglect. Slowly, inevitably. But for those who remained, Silver Creek remained everything. Their homes, their losses, their children's graves, their victories against countless odds. Perhaps they stayed out of pride or stubbornness or fear, or the simple inability to imagine life elsewhere. To them, Silver Creek was not yet dead. They might have known in some quiet corner of themselves that its fate was sealed. But knowing does not mean accepting. And so they carried on, working the soil, mending the fences, praying against the emptiness, all the while surrounded by cabins that whispered what they did not want to say aloud. Silver Creek's time was ending, and no human will could stop it. The hollow remained beautiful. Morning still broke with silver mist rising from the creek, light filtering through the tall oaks swaying on the ridge. Summer afternoons still carried the smell of earth, green and alive, with cicadas humming their chorus. At dusk, the western sky still painted the slopes in orange and gold. But what beauty once promised permanence now only emphasized the fleeting nature of the human struggle against it. The land would remain, but Silver Creek would not. By 1918, Silver Creek stood on the edge of memory rather than the edge of survival. Once the cabins had dotted the valley like footprints of promise, but now only a fraction remained inhabited. Those who lived there were ghosts of resilience, outwardly steadfast but inwardly aware that the place they fought for so hard had been reduced to little more than shadow. Where once a man rose in the morning to neighbors' voices, children calling, women stoking fires, the clang of hammers over the forge, now he rose to the sound of wind moving through empty windows and the call of crows perched on cabins that no longer belonged to anyone. Silver Creek still bore its name, but the name rested more as a memory than as a living truth. The Great War raged overseas, and though the Ozarks were far from the thunder of cannons, even here its echo was felt. Young men had gone off, leaving behind fathers already too weary to match their ambition. Letters occasionally returned, marked by trembling handwriting, sometimes stained as though miles carried not only ink, but sorrow through the paper. Families gathered around lantern light to hear the words read aloud. News of sons alive, sometimes news of sons lost. For those who remained, the war was not a rallying point. It was another reminder that the world outside kept moving forward while Silver Creek stalled, forgotten, stranded in its hollow. The population had dwindled to fewer than 7 families. Each one kept to itself more than ever before, the collective energy that once bound neighbors being replaced with private toil and silence. The church's gatherings continued, but now they were almost surreal. The preacher's voice thundered across pews that were half as full as the rows of the empty homes just beyond its walls. Women sang hymns with voices stretched louder to fill the void, while children stared into space or shifted in their places, distracted by the silence behind the noise. It was faith stripped down to stubbornness, a belief maintained less because of hope than because of the terror of admitting hopelessness outright. The blacksmith's shop was mostly silent now, its roof cracked and its door often shuttered. Elijah Barnes still lit his fire when there was something to mend, but weeks could pass with no work at all. He grew older, his arms still strong but his beard shot through with grey, and his hammer blows weaker than the rhythm he once carried. He often worked less for necessity than for defiance. The sound of iron striking iron in Silver Creek was a protest against silence, against forgetting, against the creeping knowledge that when his fire went out, there would be no other forge to replace it. He kept working because his work meant the town still had a centre. The schoolhouse reduced itself to a handful of children, their slates scratched with arithmetic, barely heard above the whispers of wind through gaps in the boards. Miss Huffman remained at her post, her face lined more now, her once bright youth hardened by the years in this hollow. She continued to teach as though there were a crowd before her, pressing knowledge into small minds, even when she knew that knowledge meant their departure. In her heart she must have understood she was teaching them not to stay, but to leave. Yet she could not stop. It was not obedience to routine, but loyalty to the faintest ember of Silver Creek's future, however brief. The rest of life was toil stripped bare of spirit. Gardens grew smaller. Livestock became few, their pens sagging, grass creeping through cracks in the wood. The creek still reflected silver in the morning light, but fewer children splashed in it. Fewer chores drew women to gather water there. Fewer voices filled the air. Only the sound of hatchets, tired footsteps, the occasional bark of a lonely dog. It was survival reduced to habit, and yet the people stayed. Some stayed out of loyalty to the graves behind the churchyard, others from sheer stubbornness, unwilling to leave land they had broken with their own hands. Pride was thick here. Each man hated the idea of abandoning effort, invested across a decade. Women hesitated too, remembering children born in these cabins, bread baked in these stoves, songs sung in this hollow. To leave was to admit the past 10 years of pain and labor had bought them nothing. To stay was to pretend that permanence could still be carved from something already dissolving. Both choices carried impossibilities, and so many remained frozen between them, as though staying delayed the decision forever. Neighbors who once leaned on each other now carried burdens alone. When storms came, and they always came, roofs were mended by only the pair of hands that lived beneath them. When fences toppled, only fathers and sons rebuilt them. When sickness swept through, it was borne privately, contained within 4 walls that no longer had neighbors close enough to lend aid. The communal instinct had drained away with the population. Now each cabin was an island, breaking down piece by piece against the storm of hardship. Still, there were nights when the hollow whispered of what it once was. Sometimes a Sunday service filled with psalms lifted clear into the hills, carrying on the wind not as a whisper, but as a strong remembrance. Sometimes the forge blazed mightily again for a single evening, and the sight of its glow on the horizon called memories of days when men gathered there to laugh and argue. Sometimes children's laughter rang from the banks of the creek, brighter than the silence could suppress. Those nights were cherished fiercely, treasured as proof that Silver Creek was not yet finished. But in truth they were ghosts, flickers of a former flame. Morning always came, and reality took its place again. The land did not pause for them. Fields worn thin by overuse gave less each year. The floods, which had haunted them from the beginning, returned still, erasing what survivors planted with the same indifferent strength. Animals taken by predators were not replaced. Tools fell into disrepair, waiting for a blacksmith's repair that sometimes never came. The forest crept closer every season, weeds curling along forgotten paths, trees reclaiming fences and doorsteps with quiet inevitability. The land was patient. It had seen people come before, and it would see them go again. By 1919 and into 1920, Silver Creek no longer resembled a settlement at all. To a stranger passing through, it looked almost deserted. A few smokestacks here and there, one or two cabins with doors open, but silence lying heavy upon all. Where 20 families had once envisioned permanence, fewer than half a dozen souls clung to the hollow's edges. They did not call it abandonment. They did not speak of failure. To them it was life, simply life as it was. Thin, yes, but still theirs. To outsiders, though, Silver Creek was already gone. A name spoken as warning and little more, a testament to just how harsh and unforgiving these hills could be. But to the last who remained, these empty roads and shuttered cabins were not ruins, they were home. And for as long as they drew breath, Silver Creek remained alive, even if only faintly, even if only in memory. For them, that was reason enough to endure another day, another year, another season, in a place the world had already forgotten. By 1921, Silver Creek was little more than a whisper of what it had been. The name still carried among the families who had first brought wagons into the valley, but what they had once called a town now resembled only a scattering of cabins swallowed by weeds. The air carried a silence heavier than any storm had ever brought, and it was a silence not of peace, but of absence. The last families endured only by stretching themselves beyond reason. Men worked soil nearly barren from years of overuse, scattering seed in furrows they knew would yield less and less. Women baked with flour stretched so thin that meals barely filled bellies, their eyes fixed with worry on children who needed nourishment more than scraps could ever give. Those children themselves knew instinctively that Silver Creek was fading. They played less, laughed less, their small footsteps echoing too loudly through empty lanes where once there had been crowds of voices. The church no longer filled. A handful of benches carried the same weary faces week after week, the songs rising thin and wavering, audible more in determination than in strength. The preacher's voice grew quieter too, his words at times sounding less like sermons and more like laments. He spoke not of growth and future, not even of survival, but of legacy, of endurance in memory if not in life. His flock nodded, lips tight, heads lowered not only in prayer but in resignation. They were not building a town anymore. They were bearing witness to its slow fading. Even the forge, that once steady heartbeat of Silver Creek, cooled more often than it burned. Elijah Barnes struck his iron fewer times each season, his hands tired, his eyes dulled from both age and disappointment. Some mornings he opened the doors only to stare into an empty space. No customers waiting, no tools to mend. He made nails and plowshares simply to keep himself busy, though he knew too well there were no neighbors left who needed them. The hammer that had once been the sound of progression became only a lonely rhythm, reminding him, and anyone who wandered past, that a settlement without people could not keep a blacksmith alive. Year by year, abandonment spread like a slow contagion. Cabins closed, their logs darkened with weather, doors tied shut with rope, windows stuffed with rags against the rain. Fences sagged and then collapsed entirely. Livestock sold off or left to roam into the wild. The old paths that linked each family fell into disuse, grass springing up quickly between stones, until the outlines vanished altogether. If you walked through Silver Creek in those last years, what you saw no longer resembled a village at all, just isolated markers of where life once pulsed. Departure was rarely announced. Unlike the first families who had left with wagons piled high, the final departures were quiet, discreet, even ashamed. A man might step outside one morning, look across fields thin with failure, and finally decide there was no more reason to break his back for ground that gave nothing in return. He would pack slowly, not with urgency but with sorrow, placing each tool, each cup and quilt into a wagon while neighbors pretended not to watch. By the time the family walked out of the valley, there were no farewells shouted down the road, only silent eyes marking their leaving. Everyone who remained knew those wagons would not return, and everyone wondered when their own turn might come. Some held on out of sheer devotion to the land. Graves behind the churchyard tied them to this hollow with weight heavier than poverty. They whispered about duty to those buried there, their children, their parents, their firstborns lost to fever. But even devotion has limits when food runs out and loneliness becomes unbearable. The forest crept closer each season, swallowing yards and walls, pressing itself against cabins as though reminding those who remained that the hills would reclaim what belonged to them. Silence thickened. Where children once played barefoot in mud, coyotes padded softly under moonlight. Where hymns floated across the fields, owls hooted their unanswered calls. Silver Creek was no longer a settlement. It was becoming wilderness again. By the winter of 1922, only 2 families remained. Their cabins sat a mile apart, each clinging to its patch of cleared land, lamps glowing faintly against the long, dark, smoke thin in the biting night. They carried on in isolation, pretending still that Silver Creek had life to it, though each time they stepped outside their doors, the truth pressed down on them. Alone, scattered, without neighbors, they were no longer communities. They were survivors enduring without reason enough to endure. The final death of Silver Creek did not come from fire, nor from flood, nor from violence. It came from silence. When the last wagon rolled out, its wheels creaking, its passengers glancing back over their shoulders at cabins already weathering into ruin, Silver Creek ceased to exist as a place. Its name faded from conversation, its lanes from memory, its homes from history. Within months the forest closed in, saplings sprouting through porches, birds nesting where rafters had once held lamps, wild vines embracing the stones around the churchyard. The land was patient. The land had always been patient. And when the people withdrew, the land reclaimed everything as though it had waited from the beginning. There was no marker placed, no signpost to say that families had lived here, that children were born and buried here, that fields were ploughed and prayers raised, that iron rang out in defiance against silence. There was only disappearance, quiet, steady, final. Silver Creek did not collapse in spectacle. It faded like smoke carried off the ridges by the wind, lost into the folds of the Ozarks, where countless other names had already dissolved. In the silence of its absence, it left behind only whispers, and those whispers would grow softer with each generation, until no one remembered the sound of life once carried by the creek that flashed silver in the dawn. By the mid-1920s, the name Silver Creek had already begun to slip from common knowledge. Local maps dropped it without ceremony, leaving only a blank curve of valley where once a cluster of cabins had stood. Postal routes no longer recognized it. Traders, who had once gouged the settlers with high prices, no longer bothered to travel the twisting road that led into the hollow. For them, the silence was proof enough. The place was gone, and with it any reason to remember it. The land, always patient, erased quickly what man abandoned. Roofs sagged until they fell, rain tearing open walls and letting vines curl inside. Saplings rose in what had been gardens, their roots threading through dirt that once yielded crops no harvest could sustain. Fence posts leaned, splintered, then disappeared entirely beneath cedar and oak that spread unbothered. By the end of the decade, if one did not know where to look, it was easy to stand in Silver Creek's valley and never realize people had lived there at all. But memory lingered stubbornly, carried not in records, but in whispers. Families scattered into Springfield, into St. Louis, farther even to Kansas and Oklahoma, carried pieces of Silver Creek within them. Parents told children, "We once lived in a place so quiet, so hidden, it felt as if the world itself forgot us." They spoke of cabins built by their hands, of winters survived despite hunger, of hymns echoing against the ridges. But memory is fickle. Children grew restless at such stories, listening but never truly hearing. They lived in towns alive with electricity and storefronts, surrounded by lights and opportunity. What was Silver Creek to them? But a name tied to hardship they had no reason to carry. The few who recalled with clarity left faint traces. 1 or 2 newspaper articles referenced a failed Ozark settlement, deserted in the early 1920s. A county historian wrote a paragraph describing an unnamed community along a creek that could not sustain itself beyond 15 years. But names faded. Dates grew uncertain, and Silver Creek blurred into the long list of places that had tried and failed to endure against the land. Unlike towns connected to railroads, unlike communities with records and churches still standing, Silver Creek dissolved half into silence, half into myth. Travelers on occasion stumbled upon its remnants, a chimney standing alone in weeds, a square of stone foundation vanishing beneath earth, a rusted hinge half buried by moss. They returned to nearby towns speaking of old ruins in the hills, but even their words faded fast, replaced by other talk, other news. The Ozarks held countless such ruins. One more did not stir wonder for long. Fishermen along the creeks whispered about it quietly, sometimes around fires. They said a town had once lived up in those woods, stubborn as stone, until one day it simply vanished. Some swore they heard faint laughter, or bells on windy nights, though in truth it was most likely nothing more than coyotes or owls. It was easier perhaps to explain strange noises as echoes of forgotten lives than to accept that silence alone filled the hollow. These became the only legends Silver Creek carried, not of ghosts or curses, but of loss, of lives that faded too quickly into obscurity. By the 1930s, the country had entered the Great Depression, and Silver Creek was no more than a ghost within older people's minds. Families struggling to survive in cities had little reason to recall a hollow that had itself failed from poverty. Younger generations asked fewer questions, and soon enough the knowledge passed away with those who had lived it. Those who had been children in Silver Creek became adults themselves elsewhere, never speaking often of their birthplace, ashamed, perhaps, or unwilling to admit they had been born in a place that did not last. Thus Silver Creek lived only as fragments, broken shards of memory scattered across families, conversations, fading into the great collective silence of forgotten settlements. Unlike cities with courthouses and written ledgers, unlike towns with cemeteries tended decade after decade, Silver Creek had no anchor, no institution to preserve its identity. What memory remained passed only through people, and people move, people change, people die. By the 1940s, Silver Creek was spoken of rarely, and only by those old enough to recall the wagons, the fields, the songs by the creek at dawn. When they passed away, so too did the last voices that remembered it as anything more than rumor. What had once been lives, children playing barefoot, prayers carried to the rafters, iron hammered against steel, was now nothing more than silence filtered through thick forest air. Perhaps the truest tragedy of Silver Creek was not that it ended, but that it disappeared so completely, leaving behind almost nothing. No sign, no stone marker, no standing ruin recognizable from the distance of years. The land took it back with such efficiency that history itself forgot to mention it. In the end, Silver Creek became not just a settlement that died, but a settlement forgotten almost as soon as it lived. Today, if you walk through the valley where Silver Creek once stood, you will not find signs waiting to tell its story. No monument rises to mark the courage of families who broke soil there. No boards hang, weathered but legible, naming the blacksmith, the preacher, the teacher, or the children who once filled the air with laughter. Instead, you will find forest. Thick, unyielding, thriving forest, rising in layers of oak and cedar, as though no hand ever pressed it back. The creek still runs, its surface catching sunlight at dawn in bright flashes of silver, the same beauty that had given the settlement its hopeful name. But now it reflects only trees and sky. Human faces do not gather there anymore. If you listen carefully in that place, you hear only the sounds of the Ozarks as they always were, leaves moving with the wind, birds cutting the silence with their calls, the water rushing endlessly over stone. Yet some who know where to look swear the hollow carries a different kind of weight, the sense that lives once moved through it. Whether real or imagined, the memory of Silver Creek lingers not in the ground, not in structures, but in the imagination of those who still care to wonder. Silver Creek's story is not one of failure alone. It is one of persistence, of people who tried valiantly to carve permanence from a land as wild as it was beautiful. They endured floods, storms, hunger, and illness. They stood together when togetherness mattered most, and even when division crept in, they carried on as long as any hearts remained to carry on. For 15 years there was life here, life as dignified and real as in any city. And then quietly it vanished. There is a lesson in such a disappearance. Silver Creek reminds us that not all communities are meant to last forever. Some burn bright for a moment and are gone. Yet in their brevity they contain an entire universe of effort, love, labor, faith, and loss. To dismiss them as failures is to misunderstand the nature of human resilience. Even when they fade, they leave behind reminders that every settlement, every city, every country is built not on its permanence, but on the fragile hope its people carry from one day to the next. What remains of Silver Creek is not visible to the eye, but to the imagination. Somewhere beneath layers of soil and leaf lie the outlines of cabins, Perhaps stones where a hearth once warmed weary bodies, or nails rusting where Elijah Barnes once hammered with defiance against the silence. Somewhere near the creek may rest the faint signs of children's footsteps long since erased. But mostly, what remains are questions. Who sat outside their cabins under the stars in those last nights, knowing the valley would not hold their children? Who walked the muddy road for the final time, looking back over their shoulder, wondering if history would remember what they tried to build? History, of course, did not. Silver Creek fell into the category of places lost without ceremony, recorded nowhere but in faint conversations, remembered only in fragments. But history's silence should not be mistaken for insignificance. Every life lived there held weight. Each family that stayed, even if for only a season, mattered. Their struggles, their laughter, their prayers, their stubborn daily labor, they mattered. If the world forgot them, it is only because the world so often forgets what does not fit easily into records and ledgers. The Ozarks are scattered with such places. Valleys where you can walk for an hour and find only a lone chimney, moss creeping between stones, or a grave marker with no name still legible. Each of those places carries its own story, precious but hidden, fragile but worthy of remembrance. Silver Creek stands for all of them. It is not a ghost town in the traditional sense, for it left behind no streets, no storefronts, no skeletal remains of industry. It is more abstract than that. It is a ghost of memory itself, a town erased so thoroughly that we strain even to prove it ever existed. And yet it did, the forest reclaims. It always will. That is its lesson, perhaps the greatest of all. Human hands cut down trees, turned soil, set fence posts, rang hammers, lit fires, raised children, and believed themselves the authors of permanence. But the forest is endless in its patience, and when the wheels of a final departing wagon creak out of a valley, the forest waits no longer. It grows back slowly, silently, until the hollow looks as if no hand ever touched it. Silver Creek became forest again, and one day, so too will every other place humans build. But if you know where to look, if you pause along the ridges of the Ozarks and let your eyes search the valleys, you may feel it. The ghost not of people, not of superstition, not of haunted tales, but of effort itself. You may sense the hum of what once was. Children singing under the roof of a one-room schoolhouse, neighbors gathering at the forge, mothers baking bread when supplies were almost gone, fathers staring beyond the ridge at horizons they could never reach. You may feel their stubbornness in the roots beneath your feet, their faith in the wind moving through the trees, their memory woven inseparably into the soil where they once worked and fell. Silver Creek did not last, but it lived. And sometimes to live at all against such odds carries its own kind of permanence. In the end, the story of Silver Creek is not only the story of one forgotten town in the Ozarks, it is the story of human aspiration anywhere. It is a reminder of how fragile we are, how small our victories against time, and yet how meaningful even the most fleeting moments can be. Because while the forest may erase the cabins, while history may silence the names, the existence of Silver Creek proved that for a time, however brief, people believed this valley could be home. That belief alone deserves remembrance. So when the wind cuts through the ridges of the Ozarks, rustling the leaves until they shimmer in the morning sun, perhaps that is Silver Creek's voice, no longer a hymn from a dozen families, no longer the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, but a whisper, faint yet enduring, reminding us not of what was lost, but of what was lived. Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, we uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, it means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.